Hi everyone, I am going to do an editing tutorial today in Lightroom of an image I took of one of my branding clients. And what is interesting about this image is that it was taken on a very cloudy day, and I did use a little bit of off-camera flash, but I'm going to be trying to edit it to make it look as light and bright as possible, consistent with my portfolio. And as many of you know, I do edit with presets, but I'm not going to be using presets today. I'm going to be using just the Lightroom module, the Develop module, and using all of their options here without the help of presets. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. First of all, my camera settings: ISO 800, 50mm lens, 2.8 and 1/25th of a second. Again, I did have some off-camera flash that I was bouncing into a window, which was on the camera right side, bouncing back into a window to give some extra boost here. But as you can see, the image is still quite dark. So what I like to do very first and foremost before I make any edits is I'm going to go down to this lens correction, and I'm going to click these two items, and that is just going to adjust for and account for any lens distortion that may have happened with your lenses, which happens. You can see like the edges sort of get darker. And chromatic aberration, doesn't really happen too often, but sometimes you're going to see some fringing on areas of high contrast. You might see like a purple outline occasionally, so I just go ahead and click that, which helps with that issue. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to go back up to the main bar here, and I'm going to immediately increase the exposure. And right away, this image reacts really well to that boost in exposure. I'm going to go ahead and lower the highlights. And before I go any further, I am going to boost this contrast up right about there. And that's looking really good. Let's see, the next thing. Sorry for that pause, guys. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play with my shadows. And this is something that I do based on the image. And what I sometimes do is just bring this up and down and to see where I want it. And I do want to boost the shadows here to bring some of that detail back in our hair. With the whites, again, sometimes I just play with these to see where I want it. But honestly, I think I'm going to leave the whites alone right now. Black, same thing. I kind of just play around to see like where the good setting would be, and I'm just going to leave that one alone actually as well. So the next thing I like to play with before I go into any of these items is this like tone curve, and sometimes I just experiment with like the existing settings here. So there's linear, there's medium contrast, and there's strong contrast. So that's like almost giving it some pop. So I'm actually going to go with medium. And what I'm then going to do is now I think it is like a little bit darker in the shadows. So I'm going to boost the shadows just a little bit more. Okay, now this image, the white balance is pretty good. But one thing I like to do with white balance is I base it a lot of the times off of their skin. So with her skin, there's different tones, different values of, greens and magentas. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with bringing down the magenta here just a tad and see how that looks in the overall image. And I do think that pulled in a little bit too much green. You can see some green here. So I'm going to actually bring that back up just a tad. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the other whites in the image and see how it's comparing to this white here. So when you're in Lightroom, I really recommend you use this white view in your editing settings so you can adjust that in your preferences here. I think it's going to be the interface, and so I have white and white. So that does help with getting some good white balance. Okay, so then the next thing that's kind of bugging me is the alignment of the image. So what I mean by that is the background is crooked here, and sometimes that just really is a distraction. So I'm going to go ahead and use my crop tool to straighten that out. And now I'm not loving it too much because now the foreground looks a little crooked. So I'm going to bring it back just a little bit, maybe to what I'm looking at is this line here. And I think that looks pretty good. Yes, right there is where I would like it. Okay, so the image is looking a tad, maybe a tad warm to me. Her shirt is white, and I'm going to bring down this just a tad. Yes, that looks a little bit better where I generally, actually I might bring it up just a little bit. Sorry about that. And so I'm going to bring that up just a tad. Okay, that looks good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, what I'd love to do is, what we're seeing here is we are seeing a little bit of darkness on this side, and I would like to even that out. So one trick I've been using in this type of situation where maybe the background is a little darker than the subject is I've been using the radial gradient. So I'm going to use this radial, they call it the radial filter, I think, on Lightroom. So I'm going to bring this, just drag it, sort of make a shape around her body. And it doesn't have to be like exact, but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to exposure here. And then what this does is it ultimately like changes around her using like the circle as its guide, right? So I'm going to boost the exposure around her just a little bit, just like that. And what I'm seeing now is I actually want to bring back some of those highlights. So I'm going to go back into my highlights and bring down the highlights just a tad, or the shadows, sorry, not the highlights, the shadows. Okay. That's really, honestly, what I would end up doing with this image. I probably wouldn't do too much more, and that's looking really good, sort of in line with my edits. The only other thing I think maybe you could experiment with is to even out this darkness. If that bothers you, you could use a linear filter, which is this guy here, and then you can again go back to that exposure, or maybe even shadows, since it is sort of a shadowy area, and you can increase your shadows that way and just sort of pull it. And what it's doing is it's starting the effect down here and gradually dragging it across. So you can see how that works, just like that. And you can adjust the angle here, something like that maybe. So that looks really good. And then that's pretty much it, guys. It's really basic. I wouldn't do anything else for this image. So thanks. I hope this is helpful, and excited to see how you guys do.